At my own Thanksgiving dinner, just as I sat at the head of the table, my husband's new assistant slapped me hard across the face. "No manners," she screeched. I did not cry. I stood up and slapped her back twice as hard, sending her crashing into the china cabinet. But the real betrayal came when my own mother and brother rushed to comfort her, screaming that I was ruining my husband's $50 million buyout. They had no idea that I held the keys to that very buyout in my pocket. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Sienna. I am 34 years old, and for the last 5 years, I have played the role of the boring, quiet freelance financial consultant. It was a disguise I wore willingly to protect the fragile ego of my husband, Preston. Preston is 35, a tech CEO in Seattle whose software startup was on the verge of a massive acquisition. We lived in a sprawling luxury home overlooking the Puget Sound, a house I curated to perfection with my own hard-earned money. To my mother, Beverly, and my older brother, Jason, Preston was an absolute god. He was their golden ticket, the tech genius, who was going to elevate our family to high society. They treated me as if I was merely lucky that a man of his stature had settled for an ordinary numbers cruncher. I let them believe it. I let them mock my modest wardrobe and my quiet evenings working on my laptop. They did not know that my laptop was a secure terminal and that I was actually the senior managing partner of Apex Capital, the anonymous angel investment firm that secretly owned 80% of Preston's company. I had funded his startup through a blind proxy to protect him from his own terrible business instincts, wanting to see him succeed without damaging his pride. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a peaceful celebration at our home. I had spent 2 days preparing a flawless dinner. The dining room table was set with fine crystal and silver. The aroma of roasted turkey and fresh herbs filled the air. My mother and brother arrived early, already drinking my expensive wine and talking loudly about Preston's impending $50 million buyout. Jason, who was 37 and had bankrupted 3 of his own businesses, was loudly bragging about the new luxury sports car he planned to buy once Preston shared the wealth. Beverly nodded along, constantly reminding me that I needed to be more supportive of my husband's high-stress career. When Preston finally arrived, he was not alone. He walked through the front door, trailing a 24-year-old girl with long blonde extensions, a skin-tight dress, and a smug smile. "This is Brittany," Preston announced casually, barely glancing my way. "She is my new executive assistant. I told her she could join us since her family is out of state." I smiled politely and welcomed her, ignoring the sick feeling settling deep in my stomach. Brittany did not bring wine or a dessert. She simply handed me her coat like I was the coat check girl and linked her arm familiarly through Preston's. Throughout the appetizer course, she hovered over him, laughing too loudly at his jokes and whispering in his ear. My mother practically tripped over herself to make Brittany comfortable, pouring her champagne and asking fascinated questions about the tech industry. Every time I tried to speak, Jason would talk over me, steering the conversation back to Preston's brilliant coding skills. When it was time for the main course, I moved to the dining room and took my customary place at the head of the table. Preston took the seat to my right. Brittany walked into the room, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the seating arrangement. She marched right up to my chair, crossed her arms, and sighed heavily. "You need to move," she demanded, her voice dripping with absolute entitlement. I looked up at her, genuinely confused. "Excuse me, I need to sit next to Preston," Brittany snapped, rolling her eyes as if I were a slow child. "We need to discuss our $50 million buyout. Move down a seat." The sheer audacity of her demand left a heavy silence in the room. I kept my voice perfectly level. "This is my home, Brittany, and this is my table. You can sit in any of the open guest chairs." Brittany's face turned red with fury. "No manners," she screeched, and before I could even process what was happening, she raised her hand and slapped me hard across the left side of my face. The crack of her palm against my cheek echoed off the high ceiling. The sting radiated through my jaw, but I did not flinch. I did not cry. A lifetime of discipline kicked in. I slowly stood up, pushing my chair back. Brittany stood there breathing heavily, looking triumphant as if she had just put me in my place. I looked her dead in the eye, raised my right hand, and slapped her back. I hit her twice as hard as she had hit me. The force of my palm against her cheek sent her stumbling backward. Her designer heel caught on the edge of the expensive Persian rug, and she crashed hard into my antique china cabinet. Glass rattled ominously, and she slid to the floor, clutching her face and sobbing loudly. What happened next broke whatever remaining ties I had to my family. I expected Preston to be horrified by his assistant's behavior. Instead, my husband rushed past me, dropping to his knees to comfort the girl who had just assaulted his wife in their own home. "Are you okay?" He kept asking her, gently rubbing her shoulder. But the true betrayal came from my own blood. My mother lunged forward and grabbed my arm, her nails digging painfully into my skin. "What is wrong with you?" Beverly screamed. Her face contorted with unhinged rage. "You assaulted Preston's crucial employee. Are you trying to ruin everything?" I stared at my mother, completely baffled by her reaction. "She hit me first, Mom, in my own house." My brother Jason stepped up, pointing a finger directly in my face. "You provoked her. You are always so deeply jealous, Sienna. You cannot stand that Preston has people around him who actually understand his business. You are just a mediocre accountant. You should be kissing the ground he walks on, but instead you are jeopardizing our meal ticket." I looked from my brother's furious red face to my mother, who was vigorously nodding in agreement. "Jason is right," Beverly spat, releasing my arm as if touching me disgusted her. "You have no idea how high the stakes are right now. Preston is closing a $50 million deal and you are acting like a petty, insecure housewife. You need to apologize to Brittany right now before she decides to sue and ruins the acquisition." I looked down at Preston. He was helping Brittany to her feet, shielding her from me. He finally looked at his wife of 10 years, his eyes full of cold, detached annoyance. "You really crossed a line, Sienna. Brittany is vital to this buyout. If Apex Capital finds out there is instability on my team, they could pull the offer entirely. You need to fix this." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. I looked at the four of them. My mother, who only saw me as a stepping stone to luxury. My brother, a parasite waiting for an unearned payout. Brittany, a brazen opportunist trying to steal my life. And Preston, the man I had secretly protected, funded, and loved, choosing a 24-year-old assistant over his wife. The pain in my chest morphed into something sharp, cold, and incredibly focused. I reached up and calmly wiped my cheek where Brittany had struck me. I did not apologize. I did not yell. I reached into the pocket of my slacks. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of the card I always carried but never used in front of them. I pulled out a sleek, heavy, black titanium card and tossed it onto the polished mahogany dining table. It landed with a sharp metallic clink that drew everyone's attention. The card sat perfectly still under the chandelier light. Engraved in the center was the unmistakable geometric logo of Apex Capital. Preston froze. His eyes locked onto the card, and the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He knew exactly what that logo meant. It was the emblem of the firm that owned his company, the firm that controlled his entire destiny. He slowly raised his eyes to meet mine, his arrogant annoyance replaced by a sudden suffocating panic as he realized the truth. His boring freelance accountant wife was his silent boss. I smiled coldly, my voice cutting through the dead silence of the room. "I am packing my bags and tomorrow I am taking my house with me." The drive down the rain-slicked streets of Seattle felt entirely different from any drive I had ever taken in my life. I left the sprawling luxury home behind without a second backward glance. The silence inside my modest sedan was a sharp contrast to the screaming match I had just walked away from. For years I had played the part of the quiet, supportive wife driving a sensible car and wearing sensible clothes to make sure my husband never felt threatened by my success. That performance was officially over. I pulled up to the valet stand of the most exclusive high-end hotel in downtown Seattle. When the concierge saw my casual attire, he offered a polite but dismissive smile, likely assuming I was lost. I did not say a word. I simply slid that heavy black titanium card across the marble desk. The concierge's demeanor changed instantly. Within 3 minutes, I was being escorted to the presidential penthouse suite on the top floor. I walked into the massive suite and dropped my overnight bag onto the pristine hardwood floor. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, but I barely noticed it. My phone had been vibrating continuously in my coat pocket since I pulled out of my driveway. I finally took it out and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. Dozens of notifications lit up the screen, illuminating the dark room. Most of the messages were from my mother, Beverly. Her texts were a predictable and disgusting mix of emotional manipulation and blatant greed. "Sienna, get back to this house right now," she wrote in a massive block of text. "You are acting like a spoiled, jealous child. You need to apologize to Preston and that poor girl before you ruin this buyout. Think about the family. Think about the money. Do not throw away our meal ticket over a little misunderstanding." I scoffed at the glowing screen. A little misunderstanding. That was what my mother called my husband allowing his mistress to assault me in my own dining room. She was willing to sell her own daughter's dignity for a slice of tech wealth. Then there were the messages from Preston. They lacked my mother's fiery rage, but they were dripping with a condescending authority that made my blood run cold. "Sienna, we need to talk business privately," he texted. "Stop throwing a tantrum and come home. We can negotiate terms. You are overreacting and embarrassing me." He really thought I was just throwing a tantrum. He thought he could negotiate terms with his wife like a hostile vendor trying to secure a better contract. I ignored all of them. I walked over to my bag and pulled out the thick, heavy laptop my family had always mocked. To them, it was just the boring machine where I did freelance taxes for local bakeries and balanced household budgets. They had no idea it was encrypted with military-grade security software. I set it on the dining table and opened the screen, typing in my multi-factor authentication credentials. With a few keystrokes, the entire interface shifted. The plain desktop background vanished, replaced by the secure internal dashboard of Apex Capital. I let out a long breath, letting the disguise of the quiet accountant fall away completely. I was not just a partner at the firm, I was the senior managing partner. When Preston started his tech company 5 years ago, he had a decent software product but absolutely zero business acumen. He was bleeding cash, making terrible deals, and driving his startup straight into the ground. I knew his fragile pride could not handle his wife bailing him out directly. He had always been deeply insecure about money and traditional gender roles. So I orchestrated a blind proxy investment through Apex. I became his angel investor, his silent majority shareholder, owning exactly 80% of his company. I saved his dream. I gave him the capital to hire a real development team and scale his operations globally. And how did he repay me? By letting the success inflate his ego to the point of absolute delusion. He thought he was a self-made genius who had conquered the tech world entirely on his own merit. He started treating me like a boring stepping stone he had outgrown. He thought he could parade his new assistant around my house because he believed he held all the power. I navigated to the corporate finance portal on my dashboard. Since Apex Capital was facilitating the upcoming $50 million acquisition, I had full visibility into the company operating accounts. What I saw in the ledger made my blood boil all over again. Preston had not just been unfaithful and arrogant. He had been actively embezzling. He had quietly issued corporate black cards to people who did not even work for the company, masking the expenses under vague marketing and consulting codes. I pulled up the transaction histories, and the depth of his betrayal became crystal clear. There was a card issued to Brittany, his 24-year-old assistant. Her recent charges included tens of thousands of dollars at designer boutiques, luxury spas, and high-end restaurants. She was funding her lavish lifestyle with company money. There was another card issued directly to my mother, Beverly. She had been using it to pay her exorbitant country club fees and to buy expensive jewelry to flash at her friends. And of course, there was a card for my brother Jason. Jason had been using corporate funds to pay for his lavish lifestyle, pretending he was a successful entrepreneur while secretly living off the company I technically owned. He had charged everything from first-class flights to premium bottle service at nightclubs to the corporate account. Preston was buying their loyalty and their affection with my money. My family had sold me out because Preston was funding their delusions of grandeur. The anger I felt was cold and clinical. I did not shed a single tear for my broken marriage or my treacherous family. Instead, I moved my cursor over the master account controls. With one precise click, I froze Brittany's card, cutting off her access to the designer wardrobe she loved so much. With a second click, I froze my mother's card, severing her tie to the country club elite. And with a third click, I locked down Jason's account, pulling the rug out from under his fake billionaire lifestyle. I did not stop there. I restricted every single line of corporate credit Preston had authorized. I locked down the company operating accounts entirely, allowing only standard payroll and essential vendor payments to process. I stripped Preston of his financial authority with a few keystrokes. He was now completely cut off from the millions he thought he controlled. He could not spend a single cent without my direct authorization. I leaned back in the plush leather chair of the hotel suite, watching the confirmation screens pop up one by one. The silence of the luxurious room was suddenly broken by a sharp, loud ping from my terminal. It was a real-time security alert tied to the corporate accounts I had just frozen. I clicked the notification, and a detailed transaction report filled the screen. Jason was currently standing in a luxury car dealership across town. The report showed that he had just attempted to use his corporate black card to make a $120,000 down payment on a brand new sports car. He was likely trying to celebrate the impending buyout he thought was happening tomorrow. And right below the astronomical dollar amount flashed a beautiful bright red word: declined. My phone sitting on the glass table buzzed immediately. The screen lit up with a frantic incoming call from Jason, followed by a rapid-fire sequence of panic-stricken text messages. I smiled, taking a slow sip of the complimentary sparkling water I had poured myself. The Thanksgiving dinner was ruined, but my real work was just beginning. The show was going to be spectacular. The morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse suite felt like a rebirth. I had slept better than I had in years. There was no tossing and turning while listening to Preston secretly text his mistress under the covers. There was no waking up early to iron his shirts or prepare a low-carb breakfast to stroke his fragile ego. I ordered room service, drank my coffee black, and dressed in a sharp tailored suit that had been hanging in the back of my closet for years, waiting for a day exactly like this. I took the private elevator down to the main lobby, intending to speak with the concierge. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern design, featuring polished marble floors, a cascading water wall, and the quiet hum of wealthy patrons conducting discreet business over espresso. It was an environment built for people who possessed real power. That serene atmosphere shattered the moment the heavy glass revolving doors violently spun open. Jason stormed into the lobby like a localized hurricane. His face was a blotchy, rage-induced crimson. He was wearing an expensive designer jacket that I now knew was paid for with my money, but his shirt was wrinkled and his hair was a mess. He looked completely unhinged. His eyes darted around the cavernous space, wild and frantic, until they finally locked onto me. Sienna, his voice cracked like a whip echoing off the marble pillars. Several heads turned in our direction. Well-dressed businessmen lowered their morning papers. A woman sipping tea at a nearby table frowned in distaste. The concierge took a tentative step from behind his desk, but I raised my hand slightly, signaling that I had the situation under control. I was not going to run or hide. Jason marched across the lobby, his heavy footsteps thudding against the stone floor. He stopped mere inches from my table, looming over me with an expression of pure disgust. "How dare you!" he screamed, not caring who heard him. "You spiteful, pathetic, vindictive little accountant. You think you can just throw a tantrum and cut off my cards?" My phone was resting on the small glass cocktail table right beside my coffee cup. With a single smooth motion, I slid my finger across the screen and hit the record button on my voice memo app. Let him dig his own grave. I crossed my legs and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I did not cut off your cards, Jason, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and measured. I cut off Preston's illegally issued corporate accounts. There is a very distinct legal difference. Jason let out a harsh, mocking laugh that sounded more like a bark. Oh, listen to the number cruncher trying to sound like a corporate lawyer. You are just jealous. You have always been deeply jealous of me and Preston. We are the real entrepreneurs in this family. We actually take risks and build empires while you sit at a desk in the background counting other people's pennies. I looked at my older brother, marveling at his absolute staggering delusion. The real entrepreneur. This was a man who had bankrupted 3 separate businesses before his 30th birthday. First, there was his luxury sneaker brand that never produced a single shoe. Then came his boutique fitness application that crashed on launch day. Finally, his cryptocurrency consulting firm, which was little more than a scam that drained our mother's savings and alienated her friends. Each venture had failed spectacularly, destroying the resources of everyone foolish enough to trust him. And now he was standing in a 5-star hotel lobby, claiming he was a titan of industry just because he was leeching off my husband. You are not an entrepreneur, Jason, I said, my tone remaining icy and polite. You are a parasite. You tried to buy a $120,000 sports car yesterday using a corporate expense card from a company you do not even work for. Did you really think that massive fraud would not catch up to you? He slammed his hand down on the small table between us, causing my coffee cup to rattle against its saucer. I am an unofficial consultant, he yelled, spittle flying from his lips. I advise Preston on market trends. I deserve those perks. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to have my platinum card declined in front of the entire dealership staff? They treated me like a common beggar. Preston personally authorized that card for my personal use as payment for my networking efforts. You had no right to freeze company funds just because you are a bitter, failing wife. I mentally smiled. My phone was capturing every single word. He had just admitted loudly and clearly to using corporate funds for unauthorized personal luxury assets with the CEO's explicit permission. It was a textbook confession to embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. He was handing me the very rope I would use to hang him and Preston in court. You are going to unfreeze those accounts right now. Sienna? Jason continued, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. He leaned over the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. Or I swear to God I will ruin you. I tilted my head, looking at him with mild amusement. Ruin me how, Jason? I will go on every social media platform and tell the world what a psychotic, unhinged woman you are, he threatened, his eyes wide and manic. I will review bomb your pathetic freelance accounting business into the ground. I will call up your little bakery and boutique clients and tell them that you steal from your own family out of spite. I will make sure everyone knows you are a bitter and fertile disaster of a woman. You will never balance a spreadsheet in this city again. You will be completely destroyed. His words were designed to hit every insecurity he thought I had. He wanted me to cry, to break down and apologize, to beg him not to ruin my quiet, modest life. He wanted the submissive little sister who always shrank into the background when the men in the family took charge. I let him finish his tantrum. I sat there in the luxurious lobby, surrounded by the scent of fresh lilies and roasted coffee, and I looked at his red, sweaty face. I looked at his clenched fists and the absolute certainty in his eyes that he held all the power. He thought he was the predator and I was the prey. He leaned in even closer, dropping his voice into a vicious, triumphant sneer. You are a loser, Sienna. You have always been a mediocre loser, and now you are just a discarded wife. Preston is signing the $50 million acquisition deal tomorrow with Apex Capital. It is a done deal. Once that massive payout hits his personal accounts, he is filing for divorce. Mom and I are getting our cut for supporting him all these years, and you will be left with absolutely nothing. Go ahead and cry, because tomorrow morning you are completely finished. I did not cry. I did not flinch. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was a smile of lethal sweetness, a smile built on years of being underestimated, overlooked, and disrespected by the very people I had secretly protected. I looked straight into my brother's cruel, greedy eyes, relishing the moment I was about to rip his entire fictional universe to shreds. "Tell Preston the buyer just pulled out." I left Jason standing frozen in the middle of the hotel lobby, his face entirely drained of color as my words finally registered in his greedy mind. I did not wait around to watch his full panic set in or listen to his pathetic attempts to backpedal. I simply picked up my coffee, turned my back on my older brother, and walked calmly to the private elevator. I had a very tight schedule to keep, and I was not about to let his whining delay my morning. By 11 in the morning, the atmosphere inside Preston's corporate headquarters was electric with tension and misplaced arrogance. The tech company occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek, glass-walled skyscraper in the financial district. It was an impressive, intimidating space funded entirely by my silent investments, though Preston strutted through the corridors as if he had built every single inch of it with his bare hands. The walls were adorned with framed articles praising Preston's innovative vision, a vision he had entirely stolen or paid for with my secret backing. Employees buzzed around in a state of high anxiety preparing for the transition. They looked at Preston with a mixture of fear and awe, unaware that the man barking orders at them was nothing more than a puppet on my strings. Today was supposed to be his crowning achievement. Today was the day he signed the $50 million acquisition deal with Apex Capital. Preston was currently pacing in his executive suite, sweating profusely despite the heavy air conditioning. My account freeze from the previous night had sent him into a complete tailspin. He had spent the entire morning screaming at bank tellers, wealth managers, and his own internal finance team, demanding to know why his corporate platinum cards were suddenly registering as deactivated. His internal finance director had told him the lockdown was coming directly from the primary shareholder level, but Preston was too obtuse and arrogant to connect the dots to me. He assumed Apex Capital was simply doing a routine financial audit hours before the big signing. He wiped sweat from his brow, continually checking his reflection in the glass partitions, assuring himself that a $50 million check would wash away all these temporary headaches. In his mind, once the deal was officially signed at noon, he would have more than enough personal wealth to crush me in divorce court and brush away any minor banking inconveniences. He was practically salivating over the impending term sheet, completely blind to the trap closing tightly around him. Out in the VIP reception area just outside the main boardroom, the vultures were already gathering to feast. Brittany was glued to Preston's side, playing her role to perfection. She wore a completely inappropriate skin-tight designer dress she had undoubtedly purchased with my money before I cut off her card. She was acting less like an executive assistant and more like a future billionaire's wife. She was openly discussing her plans to completely redecorate Preston's house once I was officially evicted, and she complained loudly to a senior project manager that the temperature in the lobby was too low, acting as though she was already the queen of the castle. She wore a massive diamond tennis bracelet that I knew for a fact had been charged to the company's emergency vendor account just 2 days prior. Sitting on the plush leather sofas nearby were my mother Beverly and my brother Jason. They had absolutely no professional reason to be at a closed-door corporate acquisition signing, but Preston had invited them to wait in the lobby so they could immediately celebrate their impending family wealth. Beverly was already drinking expensive champagne provided by the catering staff, treating the receptionists like her personal servants. She adjusted her posture, making sure every passing employee knew she was the mother of the CEO's soon-to-be ex-wife, acting as if she had engineered this success herself. Jason sat next to her, constantly bouncing his leg. My threat from the hotel lobby had clearly rattled him, but his greed was louder than his logic. He was trying desperately to convince himself that I was just a bitter, powerless woman bluffing to save face. He kept muttering about the specific upgrades of the sports car he was going to buy, trying to manifest the wealth he felt so utterly entitled to. At precisely 5 minutes to noon, the private executive elevator dinged. The heavy glass doors slid open, and the atmosphere in the reception area shifted instantly. The security guards at the front desk had tried to stop our legal team downstairs, but my lead attorney had simply flashed a federal proxy document that granted us immediate, unrestricted access to the entire facility. We swept past the turnstiles like an invading army, a team of 6 sharp, ruthless corporate attorneys in impeccably tailored suits stepped out into the lobby. They were the acquisition team from Apex Capital, the people holding the $50 million check. And leading them walking at the very front of the formation was me. I did not look like the quiet, sensible wife they were used to ignoring. I was wearing an immaculate, commanding emerald green power suit that fit me perfectly, paired with black stiletto heels that clicked with lethal authority against the polished hardwood floor. My hair was styled sharply, and my posture radiated absolute, unapologetic power. Preston looked up from his conversation with Brittany. His eyes widened and his jaw practically unhinged. For a few seconds, his brain simply could not process what he was seeing. He stammered, stepping away from his mistress. He automatically assumed I had somehow bypassed building security to cause a massive, hysterical domestic scene right in front of his buyers. He thought I was there to beg him to come home or to publicly shame him about his affair before he got his money. "Sienna! What on earth are you doing here?" Preston hissed, marching quickly toward me to intercept me before I could reach the boardroom doors. His face was a mask of furious panic. He kept his voice low, desperately trying not to draw the attention of the lawyers standing behind me. "How did you get past the lobby security guards? You need to leave this building immediately before you ruin everything. I swear to God, Sienna, if you make a scene right now, I will leave you with absolutely nothing in the divorce. I will bury you in legal fees. You are just a freelance accountant. You do not belong in a room with serious investors." Beverly noticed me then. She set her champagne flute down on a side table and marched over her heels, stomping aggressively. Jason trailed right behind her, looking pale and furious. "What is wrong with you?" Beverly hissed, grabbing at the air near my arm, though she did not quite dare to touch me this time. "Are you completely insane? You have no business being here. You are trying to sabotage your husband's biggest day out of pure spite." "Look at her, Preston. She is dressed up like she is going to a costume party. She thinks putting on a green suit makes her a professional. Get her out of here before she scares off the real money and ruins our meal ticket." I easily sidestepped my mother's grasping hands. I did not even look at her. I did not look at Jason, whose face was currently twisting into a mask of dawning horror as he remembered my exact words from the hotel and finally realized I had not been bluffing. And I certainly did not look at Brittany, who was cowering behind Preston, clutching her designer handbag as if it could protect her from my gaze. I simply kept my eyes locked on the heavy double doors of the boardroom. The lead corporate attorney for Apex Capital, a formidable silver-haired man named Harrison, stepped forward. He moved smoothly, positioning himself slightly between me and my furious, whispering family. He looked down at Preston with the kind of disdain usually reserved for scraping something unpleasant off a shoe. Preston immediately tried to do damage control. "Harrison, I am so incredibly sorry about this disruption," Preston stammered, offering a nervous, apologetic smile to the lead attorney. "This is my soon-to-be ex-wife, Sienna. We are going through some personal issues, and she is clearly not in her right mind today. She has severe boundary issues. I will have my security team escort her off the premises immediately, so we can begin the signing. Please do not let this unfortunate domestic incident reflect poorly on the company." Harrison did not smile back. He did not offer any sympathetic understanding. He looked at Preston with an expression of absolute chilling indifference. He completely ignored Preston's frantic apology and turned his body slightly, gesturing toward me with deep professional respect. "You seem to be profoundly confused about who is conducting this meeting, Preston," Harrison said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the suddenly dead silent lobby. "I am not leading this acquisition team. I am simply legal counsel." He turned toward the open doors of the boardroom, projecting his voice so every executive assistant and family member in the vicinity could hear him with perfect clarity. "Please allow me to formally introduce the person you are actually here to meet. This is Sienna, the senior managing partner and absolute majority shareholder of Apex Capital. She holds 80% equity in this firm, and she will be dictating the terms of your future today." The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like it could crush the breath out of everyone in the room. Behind Preston, I heard a sharp, terrified gasp. Beverly, who had just picked up her champagne flute to take a nervous sip, lost all feeling in her fingers. The crystal glass slipped from her hand. It hit the polished marble floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot, signaling the end of their entire world. I did not even blink as the champagne glass shattered behind me. I simply stepped over the sparkling shards on the floor and walked past my paralyzed husband. The heavy wooden doors to the executive boardroom were standing open, waiting for the CEO. I walked right to the head of the long mahogany table and took the oversized leather chair. Harrison and the rest of my legal team filed in behind me, taking their seats with practiced efficiency. Preston finally unfroze. He stumbled into the boardroom, his face practically gray. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of a terrible car crash. He looked at Harrison, then at me, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find his voice. Brittany hovered in the doorway, clutching the frame, her eyes darting frantically between me and the angry-looking corporate lawyers. Sienna Preston finally choked out, his voice cracking embarrassingly high. "What is this? What is going on? You cannot be the senior partner. That is impossible." I opened my emerald green leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized dossier. I set it on the table and folded my hands over it. "It is entirely possible, Preston. I have been your primary investor and majority shareholder for the last 5 years. I funded this startup through a blind proxy because your business instincts were atrocious and your ego was too fragile to accept help from your own wife. I gave you the capital to succeed. And this morning I am here to formally withdraw the $50 million acquisition offer. The buyout is canceled." Preston gripped the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. "Canceled. You cannot do that. We have a term sheet. I need that payout. I have debts." "You have much bigger problems than your personal debts," I said, tapping the dossier. "This acquisition required a deep dive forensic audit of your proprietary software. When my technical team reviewed the core architecture of your flagship product, we found something highly disturbing. You did not write the foundational code for this company. You stole it." Preston flinched as if I had struck him physically. He looked wildly around the room, making sure the doors were shut, terrified of who else might hear. "My team traced the timestamps and the code structure back to a former lead developer you fired 3 years ago without severance," I continued, keeping my voice loud and unwavering. "You stole his intellectual property, buried it under a few superficial updates, and built an entire enterprise on stolen goods. If this goes to market, this company will be hit with a massive intellectual property lawsuit that will bankrupt the entire operation. You have made this company an absolute liability." "That is a lie," Preston yelled, though the sweat pouring down his forehead told a different story. "I built this software. I am the visionary. You are just trying to ruin me because you are angry about Brittany. This is a jealous witch hunt." "I am not a jealous wife, Preston," I replied coldly. "I am a fiduciary protecting my investment. And because Apex Capital holds 80% equity, we have the unilateral authority to restructure executive leadership to protect the firm from legal exposure." I opened the dossier and slid a heavy, legally binding document down the length of the table. It stopped right in front of Preston. "Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position as Chief Executive Officer," I stated, savoring the absolute shock that washed over him. "You are being fired for corporate espionage, gross mismanagement, and the embezzlement of company funds to support your mistress and my greedy family members. You no longer have any authority, access, or employment at this company." Preston stared at the termination papers. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He reached out blindly toward the doorway. "Brittany, call security. Get them up here right now. She is trespassing. She cannot fire me from my own company." Brittany did not move to help him. The moment she heard the words embezzlement and corporate espionage, her survival instincts kicked in. She had been clinging to Preston because she thought he was her golden ticket to the billionaire lifestyle. Now she realized he was a sinking ship, heading straight for federal court. Brittany took 2 large steps away from the doorway, physically putting distance between herself and Preston. "I do not know anything about stolen code," she said quickly, her voice high and defensive. I just schedule his meetings. I am not going down for this, Preston. She dropped her hand from the doorframe, turned on her designer heel, and practically sprinted down the hallway, abandoning him the second his wealth evaporated. Preston watched her run away, his eyes wide with betrayal. He turned back to me, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by pathetic desperation. Sienna, please, you are my wife. We can fix this. I will fire Brittany. I will cut off Jason and your mother. I will do whatever you want. Just do not take my company away from me. Please. I stood up from the head of the table. It was never your company, Preston. It was mine. And I am done letting you play pretend with my money. Harrison, my lead attorney, signaled the two large corporate security guards who had accompanied our legal team. They stepped into the boardroom, their expressions stoic. Mr. Preston Harrison said firmly, "You need to hand over your company access badge, your corporate phone, and your laptop immediately. You will be escorted off the premises. If you attempt to access the building or the company servers again, you will be arrested for corporate trespass." Preston looked at the two large men flanking him. He knew he had no options left. With shaking hands, he unclipped his security badge from his belt and tossed it onto the table. He pulled his company phone from his pocket and set it down next to his termination papers. He looked completely hollowed out, a broken man who had just lost his entire identity. The security guards placed their hands on his shoulders and guided him out of the boardroom. I watched as they marched him through the glass-walled corridors of the executive floor. The employees who had been terrified of him just an hour ago now stopped to watch in stunned silence as their former CEO was paraded toward the freight elevator like a common criminal. I gathered my documents, placed them neatly back into my emerald briefcase, and thanked my legal team. The air in the building felt lighter, cleaner. I walked out of the boardroom and headed for the private executive elevator. I bypassed the VIP lobby, entirely having no desire to see the looks on my mother and brother's faces. I had cut off their money, fired their meal ticket, and dismantled their fraudulent lifestyle in under 20 minutes. My work inside the building was done. I rode the elevator down to the ground floor, feeling a profound sense of peace. The heavy burdens of playing a submissive wife and hiding my success were completely gone. I walked out of the revolving glass doors and stepped onto the busy downtown Seattle sidewalk. The cool afternoon air hit my face, and I took a deep, satisfying breath. But my victory lap was abruptly cut short. Sienna. The screeching, furious voice sliced through the ambient noise of the city street. I turned to see my mother, Beverly, marching down the sidewalk toward me. She must have taken the lobby stairs to intercept me before I could reach my waiting car. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and she was clutching a thick manila folder in her hands. Jason was not with her. He was likely too cowardly to face me after his humiliating display at the hotel, but Beverly had always been a different breed of vicious. "You think you have won?" she screamed, completely ignoring the pedestrians who were stopping to stare at the commotion. "You think you can just destroy Preston and cut off your own family and walk away laughing? You are a monster, Sienna. You have always been a cold, calculating monster." I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at her with pity. "Go home, Mom. The free ride is over. Preston is broke, and I am not funding your country club memberships anymore. It is time for you and Jason to get actual jobs." Beverly let out a dark, wicked laugh. "I do not need a job," she sneered, closing the distance between us. "I just need what is rightfully mine. And I'm going to take it from you, you ungrateful brat." Before I could step back, Beverly violently slapped the thick manila folder directly against my chest. Instinctively, I caught it before it hit the pavement. I looked down at the heavy stack of legal papers in my hands. The bold black text across the front page made my blood run cold. It was a formal civil summons and complaint filed in the Superior Court. I looked back up at my mother. Her eyes were burning with triumphant malice. "You are being sued!" Sienna, Beverly spat, pointing a manicured finger at the document in my hands. "I am suing you for elder abuse and property fraud. You maliciously tricked me into signing over the title to my home years ago, and I am taking it back. I am going to expose you as a predatory monster who steals from her own mother, and I will not stop until the court strips you of every single penny you have." I stood on the bustling Seattle sidewalk holding the heavy manila folder against my chest. The sheer audacity of the document was staggering. Elder abuse and property fraud. My own mother had just served me with a lawsuit accusing me of the very manipulation and theft she and my brother had been attempting to execute against me. I watched Beverly strut away down the street, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. She was completely convinced that she had just delivered a fatal blow. She honestly believed that hitting me with a scandalous high-profile lawsuit would force me to back down and quietly hand over my wealth to keep my professional reputation intact. She had severely miscalculated my willingness to fight. I did not panic, and I certainly did not cry. I calmly walked to my waiting town car and directed my driver to head straight to the downtown offices of my primary legal defense team. I spent the short drive reading through the completely fabricated complaint. The lies were meticulously crafted to paint a picture of a vulnerable, aging widow being preyed upon by her ruthless corporate daughter. By the time I stepped into the glass-walled war room at the law firm, my lead attorney Harrison was already waiting for me. He had received a digital copy of the lawsuit from the opposing counsel just minutes before I arrived. The long conference table was covered in legal pads and digital tablets. Harrison looked up as I entered, his expression grim but focused. He gestured for me to take a seat at the head of the table. "They have formed a united front, Sienna," he said, sliding a printed copy of the opposition's demands toward me. "Beverly, Jason, and Preston have pooled whatever resources they have left to hire a highly aggressive litigation firm. They are functioning as a single coordinated unit to take you down." I picked up the document and scanned the demands. It was a masterpiece of greedy delusion. Their lawsuit claimed that I had maliciously coerced my aging mother into signing away the deed to our family home years ago when she was allegedly in a state of cognitive distress. Furthermore, Preston had attached a sworn affidavit supporting her claims. He was officially testifying that the money I used to purchase the property had actually been secretly funneled from his early tech successes. He was claiming that I was a predatory investor who had stolen his hard-earned money to fraudulently purchase real estate out from under my own mother. "They are not just looking for a quiet payout," Harrison warned, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood table. This lawsuit came attached with a massive public relations threat. Preston's lawyers have drafted a press release that they are prepared to send to every major tech, blog, financial news outlet, and local television station in Seattle. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What exactly is their narrative?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "They plan to frame you as a corporate monster," Harrison explained. "The narrative they have constructed paints you as a manipulative shadow investor who steals from her own sweet mother and illegally seizes control of her visionary husband's company out of pure jealousy. They are threatening to drag the Apex Capital name through the mud. They know that an angel investment firm relies entirely on a pristine public image and supreme ethical trust. If they launch this smear campaign, the board of directors at Apex might panic. Your institutional investors might demand your resignation to avoid the scandal." I looked at the settlement demands listed on the final page. Preston, Beverly, and Jason wanted $50 million in damages. They wanted Preston immediately reinstated as the chief executive officer of the tech company with full immunity. And Beverly wanted the deed to the Seattle estate transferred directly into Jason's name as her designated heir. They were holding my entire career and my company hostage. "We need to consider the optics here," Sienna Harrison said, his voice softening slightly with caution. "I know this is a bitter pill to swallow, but sometimes in corporate warfare, a swift, confidential settlement is the most strategic move. If we pay them to go away, we can implement an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. It would protect your position at Apex Capital and keep your family's toxicity out of the public eye. We can make this disappear by tomorrow morning." I looked at Harrison, and then I looked down at the extortion demands printed on the crisp white paper. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant comparisons, the way my mother had always treated me like a disposable stepping stone, while elevating my brother to a pedestal he never earned. I thought about Preston bringing his young assistant into my home and allowing her to strike me across the face. They thought they could terrorize me into submission because I had always played the quiet, compliant peacekeeper. I slid the settlement demand back across the table. We do not negotiate with terrorists, Harrison. I am not giving them a single dime of my money to fund their next attack against me. We are not settling this. We are going to obliterate them. Harrison sat back in his chair, letting out a long breath. If we take this to a deposition, they are going to play extremely dirty Sienna. Beverly will sit in front of a camera and cry. She will play the victim perfectly. We need something stronger than just a denial of her claims. We need undeniable proof that her entire timeline is a fabrication. I pulled my secure laptop from my briefcase and opened it on the conference table. I do not just have proof that her timeline is a fabrication. I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I bypassed the first layer of security firewalls. I am going to prove exactly what kind of mother she really is. I immediately initiated a secure video conference with my elite team of forensic accountants stationed at the Apex Capital headquarters. The screen flickered to life, showing 3 brilliant financial analysts waiting for my instructions. I need you to access the deep storage archives I ordered, looking directly into the camera. I need you to bypass the standard 10-year retention parameters and dig up the sealed personal financial records from exactly 14 years ago. I need the banking histories, tax returns, and loan originations linked to Beverly and Jason from the year I turned 18. The lead accountant nodded, and their fingers began flying across their respective keyboards, digging into the digital vaults. Harrison looked at me with deep curiosity. What exactly are we looking for, Sienna? What happened 14 years ago? I kept my eyes on the screen, watching the data decryption progress bars load. Beverly is claiming that I tricked her out of the family home using Preston's money, I explained, my voice devoid of any emotion. But Preston and I had not even met yet. The truth is that 14 years ago, the family home was actively going into foreclosure because Jason had bankrupted his very first business venture. Beverly was weeks away from living on the streets. I bought that house out of foreclosure to save her from homelessness, and I paid for it entirely with the returns from my very first independent investment portfolio. Jason did not contribute a single cent. He was too busy hiding from his creditors. Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by the financial maneuvering of an 18-year-old. So we used the original foreclosure notices and your personal banking trails to prove she was destitute and you were the sole purchaser. That completely dismantles her claim of property fraud. Yes, it destroys the property fraud claim, I said, my eyes narrowing as the final decryption firewall fell away on my screen. But that is not the real reason I am pulling these specific files. Buying that house took every piece of capital I had managed to build. I had to drain all of my resources to save her, which meant I had to rely on my dedicated college fund to pay for my university tuition. I paused, feeling the ghost of a deeply buried pain echo in my chest. But when I went to the bank to access my college fund the week before my freshman semester began, the account was completely empty. It had been drained to zero. Harrison frowned, leaning forward. Drained by who? That is what we are about to find out, I said. A notification chimed on my laptop. The forensic accountants had successfully retrieved and compiled the decades-old financial routing data. They securely transferred the heavily encrypted file directly to Harrison's terminal at the end of the conference table. I watched as Harrison opened the file. The room was perfectly silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic clicking of his mouse as he scrolled through page after page of certified bank statements, wire transfer logs, and heavily redacted loan applications from 14 years ago. I sat completely still, waiting for the pieces to connect in his brilliant legal mind. For years I had suspected the truth, but I had been too young, too poor, and too desperate for my mother's love to investigate it. I had spent years working 3 jobs and taking on crippling debt to survive, while my brother drove new cars and wore designer clothes. Now I had the resources of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm at my fingertips, and I was turning over every single rock. Harrison stopped scrolling. He froze, staring intently at a specific sequence of wire transfers and forged signature logs. The color slowly drained from his face as the sheer magnitude of the financial betrayal became clear. He read the documents again, tracing the flow of money from a protected educational trust directly into an offshore shell account linked to a failed tech venture. He slowly looked up from his screen. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the table, his eyes wide with absolute shock. "Sienna," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, disbelieving whisper. "They did not just lie about the house. They did not just invent a story for a civil lawsuit." He turned the monitor around so I could see the indisputable, undeniable proof of what my own flesh and blood had done to me when I was just a teenager trying to build a future. "If we present these documents at the deposition tomorrow morning," Harrison continued, his tone deadly serious, "your mother is not just going to lose her civil case. She committed massive, premeditated financial fraud against her own child to fund Jason's business. If these go on the legal record, your mother could face federal charges. She could go to prison." I looked at the screen, seeing the exact moment my mother had willingly sacrificed my entire future to coddle her golden child. The last remaining shred of daughterly affection I possessed withered and died instantly, replaced by cold, absolute resolve. I looked at Harrison and nodded coldly. "Print them." The deposition room felt like the inside of a commercial freezer. The air conditioning hummed loudly against the sterile white walls, but the real chill came from the people sitting across the long, polished mahogany table. A legal videographer sat in the corner, the red recording light on his camera, blinking steadily, capturing every single moment of my mother's performance. Beverly sat in the center of the opposing side, wearing a pale beige cardigan and minimal makeup. She had deliberately styled herself to look frail, exhausted, and vulnerable. Jason sat right beside her, wearing a sharp designer suit, bought entirely with my corporate funds, projecting the image of the fiercely protective older brother. Preston sat a few chairs down, looking incredibly smug, next to the aggressive, high-priced litigation attorney he had hired to destroy me. The opposing counsel spent the first hour of the deposition gently guiding Beverly through her completely fabricated narrative. My mother dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling with practiced precision. She testified under the penalty of perjury that I had mercilessly exploited her confusion and grief. She claimed that I had slipped a property transfer deed into a stack of routine household tax documents. She swore to the camera that she had never intended to give me the Seattle estate and that I had maliciously stolen the roof over her head using money I funneled from Preston's tech success. I sat perfectly still next to Harrison, my lead attorney. I did not glare. I did not roll my eyes. I did not interrupt. I just watched the woman who had birthed me commit federal perjury with the casual ease of someone ordering a cup of coffee. She painted me as a cold, calculating corporate monster who preyed on her own family for financial gain. When her lawyer finally finished his questioning, he leaned back with a satisfied smirk, clearly believing they had secured a massive payout. Then it was Harrison's turn to cross-examine the witness. Harrison stood up slowly, calmly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not raise his voice or attempt to intimidate her. He simply approached the center of the table and set down a thick, heavy stack of printed documents. "Mrs. Anderson," Harrison began, his voice smooth and dangerously polite. "You just testified that your daughter Sienna has always been financially manipulative. You claim on the legal record that she has a long history of exploiting family resources for her own personal gain. Is that correct?" Beverly lifted her chin, her frail victim act slipping just a fraction to reveal the spite underneath. "Yes," she stated firmly. "She has always been incredibly greedy. She only cares about money." Harrison nodded thoughtfully, as if he agreed with her. He picked up the first document from his stack and slid it across the table to Beverly's lawyer. "Let us talk about financial exploitation then. I would like to direct your attention to a protected educational trust account established by Sienna's late grandparents." Beverly's face twitched. The opposing counsel picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the text rapidly, a deep frown forming on his forehead. Harrison continued, turning slightly so his words were picked up perfectly by the videographer's microphone. 14 years ago, exactly 1 week before Sienna was scheduled to begin her freshman year of university, this protected educational trust contained exactly $100,000. But according to these certified banking logs and wire transfer receipts, that entire amount was drained in a single afternoon. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Preston leaned forward, his smug expression faltering. Beverly gripped the edge of the heavy conference table, her knuckles turning white. "I do not see what ancient history has to do with my house," she stammered, her voice losing its theatrical tremor. "It has everything to do with establishing a pattern of theft and manipulation," Harrison replied coldly. "These documents show that you explicitly forged Sienna's signature to bypass the trust restrictions. You illegally wired $100,000 directly into an offshore shell account registered to your son Jason. You stole your own daughter's college fund to bankroll Jason's first failed business venture." Jason practically jumped out of his seat. "That was a family loan," he shouted, pointing a finger at Harrison. "We had a verbal understanding. Harrison did not even look at my brother. A forged signature on a protected trust is not an understanding. It is a federal felony." I stared at my mother, remembering the sheer suffocating panic I felt at 18 years old standing in the university financial aid office. I had worked so hard to get into that school, and in an instant my future was wiped out. I had to take on crippling high-interest student loans just to register for classes. I worked 3 separate jobs. I waited tables at a diner until 2 in the morning and cleaned campus libraries before the sun came up just to afford my textbooks and basic groceries. I barely slept for 4 years, grinding myself to the bone, while Jason squandered my entire future on a vanity project that went completely bankrupt in 6 months. Beverly looked at her lawyer, panic flashing in her eyes. "I am her mother," she argued defensively. "I had the right to manage family finances. I was reallocating resources for the benefit of the whole family. Sienna was smart enough to figure it out on her own." Harrison's expression turned to absolute ice. "Reallocating stolen funds is a crime, Mrs. Anderson. But let us move forward to the property in question since you brought it up. You claim Sienna maliciously stole the deed to the family home 7 years ago." Harrison slid another, even thicker stack of papers across the table. "These are official bank foreclosure notices," Harrison stated, dropping the final bomb. "7 years ago, you and Jason had completely defaulted on the mortgage. You had hidden 5 separate notices of default in a kitchen drawer. The bank was actively seizing the property. You were exactly 2 weeks away from being physically evicted by the county sheriff." The opposing counsel dropped the papers onto the table, taking off his glasses and rubbing his temples. He knew immediately that his case was dead. Worse, he realized his clients had lied to him and committed massive perjury on tape. "You did not sign over a deed to Sienna in a moment of confusion," Harrison continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You were losing the house because you were completely bankrupt." Sienna stepped in and bought the property directly from the bank at the public foreclosure auction. She paid the entire balance in cash using the returns from her own early investments. Jason contributed absolutely nothing. I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes. I took the very first major payout I ever earned, money I had bled for, and I dumped every single cent of it into saving a mother who did not even love me. I saved her from living on the streets, and she repaid me by trying to ruin my life. "Sienna did not steal your home," Harrison finalized, pointing to the certified bank auction deed. "She saved you from homelessness, and she became the sole legal owner of that property through a legitimate documented bank sale. You have been living rent-free in her house for 7 years. Your entire lawsuit is a malicious documented fraud." The silence in the deposition room was deafening. The air felt entirely sucked out of the space. Beverly sat frozen in her chair, her mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. Her frail victim facade was entirely obliterated, leaving only the reality of a desperate criminal thief exposed on camera. Jason looked physically ill, staring down at the table, realizing that his sister possessed the documentation to send both him and his mother to federal prison. Preston finally realized the absolute gravity of the situation. His leverage was completely gone. His $50 million settlement demand was worthless. His extortion attempt was built on a lie, and his mother-in-law was about to be indicted for federal fraud. He realized that aligning himself with Beverly and Jason had tethered him to a sinking ship, and I was holding the only life raft. Preston abruptly stood up, his heavy chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He slammed his hand down on the table, interrupting the legal deposition completely. "This is over," Preston shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "We need to stop the recording right now. I demand an emergency closed-door mediation session immediately. We need to go off the record." Harrison looked up at him calmly, not moving an inch. "We have absolutely no reason to mediate with you, Preston. You have no legal standing, your lawsuit is fraudulent, and your witnesses have just committed perjury. We are taking this straight to a judge." Preston leaned across the wide conference table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the wood. He fixed me with a desperate, vicious glare, completely abandoning his polished CEO persona. He looked like a cornered rabid animal ready to strike. "If you do not agree to a private mediation right now, Sienna, I swear to God I will not hold back." Preston threatened, his voice dropping into a dark, menacing sneer. "You think you have won because of some old bank records, but we have a personal revelation about your future that will destroy you entirely. You either meet with us in the next room right now, or we end your life today." The emergency closed-door mediation session took place in a soundproof glass conference room located at the far end of the law firm. The abrupt shift in location did absolutely nothing to dilute the thick, suffocating toxicity radiating from the people sitting across from me. Preston had aggressively demanded that all recording devices be turned off and the court reporters dismissed from the premises. He wanted no official legal record of the blatant extortion he was about to attempt. I sat calmly beside my lead attorney, Harrison, my posture relaxed, and my hands resting lightly on the cool, polished glass of the table. Across from us sat the visual definition of desperate arrogance. Preston was sweating so heavily through his expensive tailored suit that dark patches had formed under his arms. Jason was bouncing his knee with such frantic, nervous energy that the heavy conference table vibrated slightly. Beverly had quickly reapplied her lipstick in the restroom, attempting to mask the sheer terror she had exhibited just minutes prior during her disastrous deposition. And then there was Brittany, who had apparently decided to stick around now that Preston was promising a brand new angle of attack against me. Preston slammed his hands flat on the table, leaning forward with a poorly fabricated mask of authority. "Let us stop playing these ridiculous legal games, Sienna." He began, his voice dripping with a forced, aggressive bravado. "You think you have me cornered with those ancient bank records, but you do not. I have spent the last 5 years building deep personal connections with every major technology journalist and venture capital reporter on the West Coast. If you do not give me exactly what I want right now, I will personally launch a coordinated media campaign that will completely obliterate your career. I will tell the press that you are a deranged, predatory investor who falsified documents to steal your own mother's home and hijack your husband's company out of pure vindictive jealousy. The board of directors at Apex Capital will force you to resign by tomorrow morning just to avoid the massive public relations nightmare." Harrison let out a soft, dismissive scoff beside me, but I held up my hand to silence my lawyer. I wanted to hear every single delusion tumbling out of my husband's mouth. "What exactly are your demands, Preston?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. Preston smirked, clearly thinking he had finally struck a nerve and forced me into submission. "First, you reinstate me as the chief executive officer of the company, with full legal immunity for any past financial discrepancies. Second, you step down from your managing role at Apex Capital immediately, so you can no longer interfere with my business operations. Third, you sign the deed of the Seattle estate over to us today. If you do all of that, I will walk away quietly and let you keep whatever pathetic scrap of dignity you have left in this city." Before I could even process the sheer absurdity of his extortion demands, Beverly leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a renewed sense of malicious entitlement. And the deed to the house will not be going to Preston, she declared, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. You will sign the property directly over to Jason. He is your older brother and the only true legacy of this family. He is the one who deserves the wealth and the proper foundation to build his empire. You were always just meant to support him, Sienna. That is your role in this family. You have been selfishly hoarding resources that belong to the men in this family for far too long. It is time you finally fulfilled your actual purpose and handed over what Jason rightfully deserves. Jason nodded vigorously in agreement, puffing out his chest as if his mother's deranged logic was a binding legal contract. That is right, he sneered, running a hand through his messy hair. I am the real visionary here. You owe me that house for all the stress you have caused this family. Hand over the keys, Sienna, and maybe I will let you visit on the holidays. I stared at my mother and my brother, marveling at the bottomless pit of their narcissism. Beverly was sitting in a corporate law office mere moments away from facing potential federal charges for forging my signature and stealing my college fund, and she was still aggressively demanding that I surrender my multi-million-dollar home to her parasitic son. The level of psychological manipulation she had subjected me to during my childhood was staggering, but looking at her now, I felt absolutely nothing but cold clinical observation. She was not a mother, she was just a highly malfunctioning liability. We are holding all the cards, Sienna Preston sneered, mistaking my quiet observation for fearful submission. You cannot fight the press, and you certainly cannot fight your own family. Just sign the settlement papers and walk away before we truly destroy you. To cement their supposed leverage, Brittany suddenly stood up from her chair at the far end of the table. She smoothed down her inappropriately tight designer dress and offered me a triumphant, sickeningly sweet smirk. She clearly thought this was her grand moment to secure her position as the new matriarch of Preston's stolen wealth. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated victory. Actually, there is one more reason you need to sign over the house right now, Brittany announced, her voice echoing loudly in the soundproof room. She placed both of her hands on her flat stomach and rubbed it with exaggerated theatrical affection. Preston and I are not just building a business together, we are building a family. I am 3 months pregnant with Preston's baby. He finally has a real woman who can give him the heir he has always wanted. The room seemed to hold its breath. Preston puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of his supposed virility. Jason smirked, crossing his arms as if this scandalous news somehow validated his own existence. But it was Beverly's reaction that was truly stomach-turning. My mother clasped her hands together and beamed with absolute delight, completely ignoring the fact that her son-in-law had committed blatant adultery in my home. "Oh my goodness!" Beverly gasped, tears of joy welling in her eyes, as she reached out to grab Brittany's hand. A grandson, a true heir to the family legacy. She turned her vicious gaze back to me, her expression hardening into pure venom. Do you hear that, Sienna? Preston is finally having a child you were too broken and inadequate to give him all these years. I am officially disowning you right here and now. You are no longer my daughter. I am leaving every single thing I have left to my new grandson. You are going to sign over that house today, so my grandson has a proper estate to grow up in." They waited for my reaction. They expected me to break down. They expected me to scream or cry or throw something heavy across the room. They thought the sudden revelation of a pregnancy, the ultimate physical proof of my husband's betrayal and my mother's absolute cruel rejection, would be the fatal blow that shattered my resolve. They thought invoking my supposed biological inadequacy would force me to surrender my wealth in a state of sheer emotional devastation. They thought they had finally found the weapon that would break me. I did not cry. I did not react with outrage. I looked at Preston puffing his chest like a proud rooster. I looked at Beverly claiming an affair baby as her true family legacy. I looked at Brittany proudly rubbing her stomach as if she had just won the lottery. And I burst into a slow, chilling laugh. It started low in my chest and echoed loudly off the glass walls of the conference room. It was not a laugh of hysteria or brokenness. It was the dark, genuine laughter of a woman watching her worst enemies gleefully walk straight into an active minefield. Preston frowned, his arrogant smile slipping slightly, as my laughter continued to fill the quiet room. "What is so funny?" he demanded, his voice wavering, with a sudden spike of deep insecurity. I stopped laughing. I kept my eyes locked directly on Preston's confused, sweating face as I reached down into my designer briefcase. I bypassed the legal briefs and the financial ledgers, pulling out a thick, sealed medical envelope bearing the distinct logo of a prominent Seattle hospital. I tossed it onto the polished mahogany table and slid it firmly across the glass surface until it stopped right in front of Preston's hands. "That is an absolute medical miracle," I whispered, leaning forward with a smile that could freeze water. Preston stared at the heavy white envelope resting against the glass. He looked at me, then at the hospital seal, his arrogant sneer faltering into a mask of deep uncertainty. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up and ripped open the top. He pulled out the crisp medical documents printed on the official letterhead of an exclusive private men's clinic in downtown Seattle. I watched his eyes scan the first paragraph. The room was so quiet, I could hear the sharp intake of his breath. The paperwork detailed a completely successful and entirely irreversible vasectomy procedure from exactly 4 years ago. It included his signed consent forms and the post-operative lab results confirming his absolute sterility. He had begged me to keep the procedure a complete secret. He was so terrified that his alpha male tech industry friends would view him as less of a man that he had hidden the medical files in a safe and forbidden me from ever mentioning it to anyone, especially my family. He thought those records would never see the light of day. He thought he could parade around a pregnant mistress to publicly humiliate me and extort my home. But math and biology do not lie. Preston slowly lowered the papers. His face was a sickly shade of gray. The color had drained completely from his lips, and his eyes were wide with a terrifying, hollow realization. He slowly turned his head to look at Brittany. Brittany was still standing near the edge of the table, her hands resting proudly on her stomach. Her triumphant smile melted instantly when she saw the look of pure, unadulterated horror on Preston's face. "What is it?" Beverly asked, her voice shrill with sudden anxiety. "Preston, what does the paper say about my grandson?" Preston did not answer his mother-in-law. He kept his eyes locked on his young assistant. "I cannot have children," Preston said, his voice dropping into a harsh, ragged whisper. "I had a vasectomy 4 years ago. I am completely sterile." The silence that slammed into the conference room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a massive explosion. Brittany's jaw dropped. She took a large step backward, her designer heels stumbling against the thick carpet. She looked at Preston, then darted a panicked, terrified glance across the table directly at Jason. That single split-second look was all it took. Preston caught the eye contact. He saw the sheer terror in his mistress's eyes, and he saw exactly where that terror was directed. He slowly turned to look at Jason. My brother was suddenly sweating profusely, his knee bouncing out of control under the glass table. Brittany raised her hands defensively, backing away toward the heavy glass door. "Preston, I swear," she stammered, her voice pitching into a hysterical squeak. "I did not mean to. It just happened a few times when you were out of town on business trips. He said he was going to be a millionaire soon. He said he was your top consultant. You slept with my brother." Preston roared, the sound tearing from his throat like a wounded animal. "You slept with Jason." "I am so sorry," Brittany sobbed, completely abandoning her future billionaire wife persona and shrinking into a terrified child. "It is his. The baby is Jason's. I did not know you were sterile. I thought I could just say it was yours and we would share the money." Beverly let out a high, piercing shriek. She stared at Jason in absolute horror, realizing that her golden child had not only betrayed his powerful brother-in-law, but had also impregnated his mistress and destroyed their only piece of leverage against me. Jason threw his hands up, stammering out a pathetic string of denials, but it was far too late. Preston completely snapped. The polished corporate executive vanished, replaced by a man whose entire life, business, and ego had just been annihilated in a single afternoon. Preston lunged across the wide glass conference table. He did not go around it. He scrambled directly over the polished surface, scattering legal documents, water glasses, and expensive pens in a violent crash. He tackled Jason right out of his leather chair. The two men hit the floor with a sickening thud. Preston immediately started throwing vicious, heavy punches, striking Jason squarely in the jaw. Jason screamed wildly, flailing his arms to protect his face. The sound of fists connecting with bone echoed loudly in the confined space. Beverly screamed hysterically, "Stop it! Stop hitting my son! Get off him right now!" My mother threw herself into the melee, attempting to grab Preston's broad shoulders to pull him away from her precious golden child. She clawed at Preston's suit jacket, weeping and begging them to stop the violence. Jason, bleeding from his nose and panicking under the weight of his furious brother-in-law, saw a brief opening when Beverly distracted Preston. Jason shoved his knee upward, trying to scramble away, but Beverly was standing directly in his escape path. In his desperate, cowardly scramble to save himself from Preston's fists, Jason did not hesitate. He violently shoved his own mother out of his way. Beverly cried out as the forceful push sent her crashing hard onto the floor. Her head narrowly missed the heavy metal leg of the conference table. She lay there on the carpet, clutching her shoulder, looking up at the son she had stolen my college fund for, the son she had protected and elevated above me her entire life. Jason did not even look back at her. He just scrambled toward the corner of the room, wiping blood from his mouth and cowering behind a tall potted plant. Through all of this, I simply sat back in my chair. Harrison sat beside me, equally motionless, though his eyes were wide with shock at the sheer animalistic violence unfolding in front of us. I did not scream. I did not call for help. I folded my hands neatly on the table and calmly watched my toxic family absolutely destroy each other. Every lie they had told, every manipulation they had executed, had finally collapsed under the weight of its own rotten foundation. The heavy glass door to the conference room suddenly burst open. 4 heavy-set security guards from the law firm rushed inside, followed closely by a panicked mediator. It took 3 large men to physically pull Preston off of Jason. Preston was breathing heavily, his suit-torn blood smudged across his knuckles. He glared at Jason with murderous intent, then turned his vicious gaze toward Brittany, who was crying hysterically in the hallway. "This mediation is officially over," Harrison announced, his voice slicing through the heavy, chaotic air of the room. "We will see you all in court." I picked up my emerald briefcase, stepped over the scattered documents on the floor, and walked out of the room. I did not offer my mother a hand up. I did not look at my bleeding brother or my broken husband. I walked out of the building and stepped into the cool Seattle evening, feeling a profound, intoxicating sense of victory. The alliance between my enemies was completely shattered. They had turned on each other, tearing out their own throats, leaving me entirely untouched. I returned to my penthouse suite, ordered a light dinner, and enjoyed the quiet luxury of my own space. The lawsuit was dead. The extortion attempt had failed spectacularly. Preston was bankrupt, humiliated, and facing severe legal consequences from the board. I assumed the battle was finally over. I assumed he would crawl into a hole and wait for his inevitable corporate prosecution. But I had underestimated the dangerous, unpredictable nature of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. At 2 in the morning, the silent darkness of my hotel suite was broken by a sharp, demanding ping from my secure laptop. I sat up in bed, turned on the bedside lamp, and walked over to the desk. The notification indicated an encrypted email had just bypassed my secondary spam filters. I checked the sender address. It was from Preston. The subject line was completely blank. The body of the email contained no text, no apologies, and no demands for a settlement. There was only a single, heavily encrypted audio file attached. I stared at the screen, a sudden chill creeping down my spine. Preston had just lost his company, his wife, his mistress, and his pride in the span of 12 hours. He was a desperate, cornered animal, and desperate animals do not surrender quietly. They lash out with whatever venom they have left. I clicked on the attachment and hit play, completely unprepared for the terrifying sound that was about to fill my room. The audio file began with a sharp burst of static before settling into a terrifyingly clear recording. The voice that echoed from my laptop speakers made the blood freeze in my veins. It was my voice. It had my exact cadence, my precise inflection, and even the slight measured pause I always took before delivering bad news. But the words pouring out of the speakers were a complete malicious fabrication. I listened in absolute horror as the digital ghost of my own voice confessed to a massive corporate crime. The fake version of me was speaking to an unidentified second person, laughing coldly about how easy it had been to destroy my husband. The synthetic voice bragged about paying off the former developer to lie about the software origins. It detailed exactly how I had supposedly planted the stolen code onto the company's servers myself to frame Preston. The recording painted me as a ruthless, calculating sociopath who had engineered a hostile takeover of a multi-million-dollar tech firm out of pure vindictive jealousy. The audio ended with a chilling synthesized laugh that sounded so much like my own that I physically recoiled from the computer. It was a flawless, weaponized AI deepfake. My hands shook as the audio player went silent. Preston had not just been sitting in a hotel room feeling sorry for himself. He had been actively plotting to burn my entire world to the ground. He had likely used hours of old home videos, voicemails, and recorded arguments to train an artificial intelligence model to perfectly replicate my vocal patterns. He had manufactured the ultimate piece of fake evidence. Before I could fully process the technological violation I had just witnessed, a second encrypted email hit my inbox. This one contained the text he had strategically withheld from the first message. I opened it, and the sheer unhinged malice radiating from his words practically leaped off the screen. Preston was no longer pretending to be a polished executive. He was writing like a desperate cornered criminal who had tasted blood. He gloated about the audio file, boasting that no one in the corporate world would ever be able to tell it was artificially generated. He laid out exactly what he planned to do with it if I did not submit to his demands. He threatened to release the deepfake recording directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Wall Street Journal, and every major technology news outlet on the West Coast. He described in agonizing detail exactly how the fallout would destroy my life. The moment the SEC heard a recording of a senior managing partner confessing to corporate framing and intellectual property theft, they would launch an immediate catastrophic federal investigation into Apex Capital. My institutional investors would panic and withdraw their funding. The board of directors would force me to resign immediately to mitigate the public relations nightmare. My professional reputation, built on years of flawless ethical conduct, would be permanently obliterated. Worse, the federal authorities would instantly freeze all of my personal and corporate assets pending a criminal trial. Preston was threatening to take away my freedom, my money, and my life's work in one single devastating strike. He was threatening to send me to federal prison. I read the next paragraph where his extortion demands were laid out with chilling clarity. He wanted $10 million. He demanded the funds be wired in cryptocurrency to a highly secure, untraceable offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. But the money was not enough to satisfy his bruised ego. He also demanded that I sign a quitclaim deed transferring the full legal ownership of the Seattle estate directly back to his name. He wanted his wealth and his kingdom restored. He gave me a hard, non-negotiable deadline. I had until midnight on Friday to execute the wire transfer and deliver the signed property deed. If the money was not in his offshore account by exactly 12 o'clock, he would hit send and distribute the deepfake audio to the federal authorities and the press. He ended the email with a final taunting threat. "I have absolutely nothing left to lose, Sienna. You took everything from me today. Now it is my turn. You either pay me what you owe me, or you spend the rest of your life in a federal cell. The clock is ticking." I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen in the darkened hotel suite. For a normal person, this would be the moment to panic. This would be the moment to break down in tears, call a defense attorney, and desperately try to negotiate a lower settlement just to make the nightmare go away. A normal person would look at the sheer destructive potential of that deepfake and surrender. But I was not a normal person, and I was entirely done being a victim to my family's relentless greed. I did not cry. I did not panic. I felt a surge of cold, hyper-focused adrenaline flood my system. Preston thought he was a mastermind for discovering generative artificial intelligence. He forgot that he was trying to use a digital weapon against a woman who literally funded the top cybersecurity firms in the world. I minimized the threatening email and opened a secure, heavily encrypted messaging portal on my desktop. I did not contact Harrison or my standard corporate legal team. This was no longer a standard civil dispute. This was digital terrorism, and it required a completely different kind of professional intervention. I initiated a direct line to a private top-tier cybersecurity contact I kept on retainer for Apex Capital. He was a digital forensic specialist who operated in the shadows, a man whose entire career was built on dismantling corporate espionage and tracking untraceable digital footprints. I securely forwarded him the deepfake audio file along with the encrypted source code of Preston's email. I typed a quick, precise message to my contact. I need the hidden metadata stripped from this audio file. I need undeniable, irrefutable digital proof of the IP address, the device origin, and the exact timestamp of its creation. I need you to trace it directly back to Preston's personal hardware. You have 48 hours. The response from the cybersecurity specialist came back less than a minute later. Considered it done. I closed the secure portal. My breathing was steady and my mind was moving 10 steps ahead. Friday was only 2 days away. Preston had chosen his deadline carefully, hoping the short time frame would force me into a panicked, sloppy surrender. He wanted me trembling in my hotel room, desperately moving funds to save my own skin. But Friday night was not just any night on my calendar. It was the night of the annual Seattle Tech and Philanthropy Gala. It was the most prestigious high-profile event of the year, packed with billionaires, journalists, and the most powerful industry leaders in the state. And more importantly, it was the night I was scheduled to be the keynote speaker and the recipient of the Innovator of the Year award. Preston knew about the gala. He knew I would be standing on a stage in front of the entire city, right as his midnight deadline approached. He wanted to torture me. He wanted me to stand in front of my peers, gripping an award, knowing that my entire life was about to be destroyed the second the clock struck 12. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect psychological checkmate. I picked up my personal cell phone from the glass coffee table. I opened a direct text message thread with my soon-to-be ex-husband. I did not type out a frantic plea for mercy. I did not try to reason with him or explain that his extortion attempt was a federal crime. I did not tell him that my cybersecurity team was already dismantling his digital footprint line by line. I simply typed out 2 sentences, my thumbs moving with deliberate, lethal precision. I looked at the words on the screen, knowing exactly what kind of trap I was setting. Preston wanted a public spectacle. He wanted to watch me break. I was going to give him the greatest show of his pathetic, miserable life. I hit send on the message and set the phone face down on the desk. I will give you what you deserve on Friday night. Meet me at the gala. Friday afternoon arrived with a heavy gray sky hanging over Seattle, but the atmosphere inside the secure conference room of the federal building was sharp and brightly illuminated. I sat at a nondescript metal table flanked by my lead corporate attorney Harrison and my private cybersecurity specialist. Sitting across from us were 2 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division and a senior detective from the local police department. There was no room for negotiation or mediation in this space. We were building a trap, and the bait was already perfectly set. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick, encrypted hard drive, sliding it across the metal table. The federal agent picked it up with a serious expression. Inside that drive was the absolute destruction of my husband's extortion plot. My cybersecurity specialist had spent the last 48 hours entirely dismantling the deepfake audio file Preston had sent me. He had not only stripped the metadata to prove the voice recording was artificially generated, but he had also traced the origin IP address directly back to the private router in Preston's downtown apartment. The digital footprint was undeniable. Preston had manufactured fake evidence to extort a $10 million ransom from a major financial executive, but I was not stopping at the digital extortion. I pulled a second folder from my briefcase and handed it to the local detective. These are certified financial records from my personal banking institution, I explained, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. They document 3 separate massive loans taken out against the equity of my Seattle estate over the last 6 months. If you check the signature pages, you will see that they supposedly bear my name. However, my forensic accountants have verified that those signatures are blatant forgeries executed by my mother, Beverly, and my brother, Jason. They illegally borrowed against my property to fund their luxury lifestyle. The detective reviewed the loan documents and nodded slowly. The evidence was ironclad. Extortion and felony forgery were serious offenses, and because Preston had placed a midnight deadline on his threat, the authorities considered this an active ongoing crime. The federal agents confirmed that the warrants for their arrest had already been signed by a judge that morning. They informed me that plainclothes officers would be stationed at the venue tonight. They would not move until Preston actively attempted to execute his threat, giving us the final piece of undeniable proof we needed to lock them all away. I thanked the officers, gathered my things, and walked out of the federal building. The countdown had officially begun. A few hours later, I stepped out of my town car and onto the red carpet outside the grand ballroom of the most prestigious hotel in the city. The annual Seattle Tech and Philanthropy Gala was the absolute crown jewel of the corporate calendar. It was a high society event packed entirely with billionaires, venture capitalists, prominent journalists, and the most powerful industry leaders on the West Coast. In previous years, I had always attended these events quietly, walking 2 steps behind Preston, wearing a modest dress, and playing the role of the supportive, unremarkable wife. I had spent years shrinking myself so his fragile ego could take up all the space in the room. Tonight was completely different. Tonight I was stepping into the light. I wore a breathtaking floor-length crimson gown that demanded attention. My hair was swept up into a sharp, elegant style, and a diamond necklace rested against my collarbone. I did not walk behind anyone. I strode through the massive mahogany doors of the ballroom, projecting an aura of absolute, unapologetic power. As I entered the room, the atmosphere seemed to shift. Whispers rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Word of the massive corporate shakeup at my husband's tech firm had already begun to circulate through the whispered back channels of the financial district. People knew that a silent partner had orchestrated a ruthless takeover, but very few knew the identity of the architect. Now they were looking directly at me. The ballroom was a masterpiece of opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer dresses. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with champagne and expensive delicacies. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the high-stakes networking happening all around me. I moved through the crowd with ease, greeting institutional investors and prominent tech founders who finally recognized me as the senior managing partner of Apex Capital. For the first time in my life, I was completely in my element, surrounded by peers who respected my intellect and my authority. I was scheduled to be the keynote speaker for the evening, and I was slated to receive the Innovator of the Year award. It was the highest honor of the night and the perfect stage for my final move. At exactly 11:15, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and my stomach tightened as I spotted the uninvited guests. Preston had actually shown up. He had crashed the most exclusive black tie event of the year. He must have called in a desperate favor or bribed a catering vendor to slip past the strict security checkpoints at the front desk. He was not alone. Clinging tightly to his arm was my mother, Beverly. Jason was nowhere to be seen, likely too cowardly to show his face after his humiliating physical altercation in the mediation room, or perhaps hiding out at a local bar, waiting for his payout. But Beverly was fully committed to the delusion. She wore a gaudy, outdated sequined dress that looked incredibly out of place among the modern, elegant attire of the other guests. She was desperately trying to project the image of a wealthy high society matriarch, but her nervous, frantic energy gave her away. Preston looked absolutely terrible. His tuxedo jacket fit poorly, suggesting he had lost weight from the sheer stress of his impending bankruptcy. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a cocktail napkin as he tried to blend into the crowd. He was frantically trying to intercept venture capitalists and investors trying to pitch them on a new vague software concept to save his sinking ship. But the elite crowd could smell the desperation rolling off him. Prominent executives politely excused themselves as soon as he approached, turning their backs on a man whose industry reputation was already bleeding out. Preston grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and downed it in one gulp. His eyes darted around the massive ballroom, scanning the sea of faces until they finally locked onto me. I was standing near the front of the stage, engaged in a pleasant conversation with a prominent software developer. I did not break my conversation, but I met his gaze across the room. The psychological warfare commenced immediately. Preston pulled his phone from his tuxedo pocket and held it up slightly, making sure I could see the glowing screen. He aggressively tapped his watch with his index finger, reminding me that his midnight deadline was rapidly approaching. He stood there in the middle of the extravagant ballroom, looking at me with an expression of pure, vicious malice. He truly believed he was holding my entire future hostage. He thought I was standing near the stage, sweating in terror, trying to figure out how to wire 10 million untraceable dollars from my phone before he destroyed my life. He gave me a slow, arrogant smirk and held his phone higher, displaying his thumb hovering menacingly over the screen. The unspoken threat was loud and clear. Surrender your wealth or lose everything. I offered him a tight, polite smile, raised my champagne glass slightly in his direction, and turned back to my conversation. Let him think he was the apex predator for a few more minutes. At 11:45, the ambient lighting in the grand ballroom slowly dimmed, signaling the main event. A hush fell over the hundreds of powerful guests as the string quartet faded into silence. The host of the evening, a respected veteran of the Seattle tech scene, stepped up to the illuminated acrylic podium on the main stage. He tapped the microphone and welcomed the crowd, drawing their absolute undivided attention to the front of the room. Preston abandoned his attempts to network. He left Beverly standing awkwardly near the dessert station and began pushing his way through the dense crowd of seated guests. He moved aggressively, shouldering past billionaires and journalists until he reached the wide center aisle of the ballroom. He positioned himself perfectly in my direct line of sight. He wanted a front-row seat to my absolute destruction. He wanted to watch my face crumble when I realized I had run out of time. The host began his introduction, speaking passionately about the importance of ethical investing and structural innovation in the modern economy. He spoke about a leader who had operated quietly behind the scenes for years, guiding startups to massive success before stepping firmly into the spotlight. Preston sneered as he listened to the praise. He raised his phone chest high. He opened his email application, navigating directly to the message containing the highly convincing artificial intelligence deepfake audio that would frame me for corporate espionage. He loaded the contact list containing the email addresses of every major federal regulator and technology journalist in the room. He planted his feet in the center aisle, locking his cruel, desperate eyes on me. I watched his thumb lift and hover directly over the send to all button. He was waiting for the exact moment I stepped up to the microphone so he could hit send and publicly execute my career in real time. And now it is my distinct honor, the host announced, his voice echoing powerfully across the silent, captive audience. Please welcome to the stage the senior managing partner of Apex Capital and our Innovator of the Year, Sienna. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. Hundreds of powerful people rose to their feet. I smoothed the skirt of my crimson gown, lifted my chin, and began walking slowly up the steps toward the brightly lit stage, walking directly into the trap my husband thought he had set. The applause washed over me like a physical wave as I walked toward the stage. I took the stairs one by one, feeling the heavy fabric of my crimson gown brush against the steps. The host met me center stage, smiling warmly as he handed me a stunning geometric crystal trophy. It was heavy and solid, representing the years I had spent building an empire from the shadows. I gripped it firmly in my left hand and stepped up to the clear acrylic podium. The blinding glare of the stage spotlights hit my face, but I did not blink. I looked out over the massive ballroom. It was a sea of upturned faces featuring the wealthiest and most influential people on the West Coast. They were all waiting in hushed anticipation for me to speak. But I was only looking for one face. I found him immediately. Preston was standing dead center in the main aisle, causing a pathetic disruption among the neatly arranged tables. His thumb was still pressed against the edge of his phone screen. He looked like a man holding a detonator waiting for me to beg for my life. He gave me a sharp, impatient nod, giving me a silent command to surrender. I leaned into the microphone. "Good evening," I said, my voice echoing powerfully through the state-of-the-art sound system. It reverberated off the high ceilings and settled over the crowd, commanding absolute silence. "I want to thank the board for this tremendous honor." I continued, keeping my gaze sweeping across the room before letting it fall back to Preston. For years, I operated behind the scenes, providing the unseen foundation for companies that claim to be entirely self-made. I watched brilliant ideas flourish, and I watched fragile egos take all the credit. But innovation is not just about writing a new piece of software or securing a massive valuation. True innovation requires an absolute commitment to truth. I saw Preston's jaw tighten. This was not the public resignation speech he had demanded. He shifted his weight, his thumb hovering dangerously close to the send button on his phone. I kept speaking, keeping my voice calm, steady, and razor-sharp. "We live in an era of unprecedented technological advancement," I said, projecting my voice to the very back of the room. "We have built machines that can learn algorithms that can predict human behavior and artificial intelligence that can replicate reality with terrifying precision. But with this incredible power comes a deeply dangerous shadow. We have handed the ultimate weapons of deception to people who lack the moral spine to use them responsibly." A murmur of agreement rippled through the front rows. The journalists in the room leaned forward, sensing that this was not a standard boring acceptance speech. "We are seeing a rise in digital extortion." I continued, locking my eyes directly onto Preston's sweating face. "We are seeing desperate, failing men utilize artificial intelligence to manufacture fake evidence. They create audio and video deepfakes designed to ruin the careers of the women who outshine them. We are seeing corporate fraud bleed into familial exploitation, where the people you are supposed to trust the most will weaponize technology to steal your wealth and hold your reputation hostage." Preston's arrogant smirk completely vanished. The color drained from his face as he realized I was not talking in abstract concepts. I was talking directly to him, broadcasting his exact crime to a room full of billionaires and federal regulators. He realized I was not going to pay the $10 million. I was not going to sign over my house. I was openly defying him. His eyes narrowed into a glare of pure, unadulterated hatred. He raised his phone higher, making sure I saw him do it. He pressed his thumb down hard against the screen, hitting the send button on the encrypted email that contained the deepfake confession. He stood there, his chest heaving, waiting for the digital bomb to go off. He waited for the cell phones of every journalist in the room to chime simultaneously with the breaking news of my manufactured confession. I stood at the podium and watched him wait. 1 second passed, then 5, then 10. The ballroom remained perfectly silent save for the echo of my own breathing through the microphone. No phones chimed, no breaking news alerts flashed across the room. Preston frowned. He looked down at his screen. He tapped the display frantically, his thumb jabbing at the glass over and over again. The email application was frozen, with a tiny loading circle spinning endlessly in the center of his screen. He swiped down to check his control panel, and I watched his shoulders stiffen in absolute panic. He had 0 signal bars. The hotel network connection had vanished completely. His cellular data network was entirely blocked. He was holding a dead piece of glass and metal. He did not know that less than 50 feet away, standing just outside the ballroom doors, my private cybersecurity team had activated a highly sophisticated localized signal jammer. They had isolated the exact coordinates of Preston's device and thrown a digital blackout blanket over his entire immediate radius. He could not send a text message, he could not make a phone call, and he certainly could not transmit a massive encrypted audio file to the press. He was trapped in a technological dead zone, entirely cut off from the outside world. Preston took 2 frantic steps to the left, holding his phone high in the air like a desperate tourist trying to catch a signal in the wilderness. He tapped the screen again, his face twisting into a mask of pure terror. He bumped into a waiter carrying a tray of champagne, nearly knocking the crystal glasses to the floor. Beverly, who had been standing near the dessert station, hurried over to him, pulling on his sleeve and asking him what was wrong. He ignored her, aggressively shaking his phone, as if physical violence could force the signal to return. I watched him struggle, savoring every single second of his pathetic, impotent panic. He had tried to use technology to destroy me, and I had simply turned the lights out on his entire operation. I leaned back into the microphone, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling, lethal authority. "It is very easy to talk about these dangers in theory," I said, capturing the crowd's attention once again. "It is easy to assume that corporate extortion and deepfake blackmail only happen in movies or to other people. We want to believe that our boardrooms and our dining room tables are safe from that kind of desperate, malicious criminality." I stepped out from behind the clear acrylic podium. I walked to the very edge of the stage, letting the heavy crimson fabric of my gown trail behind me. I looked directly down at Preston. He had finally stopped shaking his phone. He was staring up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the dawning realization that he had walked blindly into an inescapable trap. But theoretical warnings are rarely enough to inspire real change. I continued, my voice echoing like thunder across the grand ballroom. "Tonight, instead of just talking about the dangers of digital extortion, I would like to provide this room with a live demonstration of criminal desperation." The audience collectively caught its breath. The silence in the room was so profound, you could hear the soft hum of the stage lights. Beverly grabbed Preston's arm, her face pale, finally sensing the catastrophic danger they were in. She tried to pull him toward the exit, but Preston was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his impending destruction. I raised my right hand and made a sharp, deliberate gesture toward the back of the ballroom, signaling the audio-visual team stationed in the sound booth. The massive overhead speakers mounted around the perimeter of the ballroom suddenly crackled to life. A sharp burst of static hissed through the air, silencing any remaining whispers in the crowd. But it was not Preston's artificial intelligence deepfake that played over the speakers. It was not the manufactured recording of my voice confessing to corporate espionage. It was a completely authentic, crystal-clear recording. The sharp burst of static faded into the undeniable sound of my older brother Jason screaming. His voice bounced off the crystal chandeliers and echoed against the gold leaf walls of the ballroom. The recording was the exact audio I had captured on my phone during his unhinged ambush in the hotel lobby. Everyone in the room heard Jason violently bragging about his fake entrepreneurship. They heard him admit to trying to buy a $120,000 sports car using stolen corporate funds. They heard him explicitly state that Preston had authorized the embezzlement to buy their loyalty and fund their lavish personal lifestyles. The venture capitalists sitting in the front row lowered their champagne glasses, their faces contorted with absolute disgust. These were men and women who ruined companies over minor accounting errors. Listening to a CEO permit blatant embezzlement to pacify his incompetent brother-in-law was the ultimate cardinal sin in their world. Then the audio shifted. A brief dial tone rang out, followed by the sound of a recorded conference call. This was the final nail in their collective coffin. It was a legally obtained wiretapped recording, intercepted and verified by the federal agents who had been monitoring their communications since my forensic accountants uncovered their initial mortgage fraud. The clear, unmistakable voice of Preston filled the silent ballroom. He was speaking directly to my mother and brother. "I want $10 million, he said on the recording, his tone dripping with malicious greed. "I am going to send her the artificial intelligence voice clone tonight. She will think it is real. If she does not sign the deed to the Seattle estate over to us, I will send the fake confession to the authorities and destroy her company." My mother's voice chimed in, next sounding greedy and vicious over the ballroom speakers. "Just make sure Jason gets the title to the house, Preston." I already forged her signature on the last 3 equity loans. We took hundreds of thousands from her property value, and she never even noticed. What is one more fake signature to get the whole property for ourselves? She deserves to be ruined for cutting off our credit cards." The collective gasp from the audience was loud enough to drown out the string quartet tuning their instruments in the corner. The sheer depravity of a mother laughing about committing felony forgery against her own daughter sent a shockwave of revulsion through the crowd. This was a room full of people who spent their entire lives evaluating risk and destroying liabilities. They were looking at Preston not as a fellow innovator, but as a toxic, radioactive criminal. Prominent technology journalists were already furiously typing on their mobile devices, drafting the headlines that would hit the morning papers and completely obliterate whatever remained of Preston's industry reputation. I stood at the podium looking down at the man who had promised to ruin me. Preston stood completely paralyzed in the center aisle. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out shell. His phone slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. He could not run. He could not hide. He could not talk his way out of a recorded confession playing in front of the most powerful people in the state. He was trapped in the blinding light of his own consequences, breathing heavily as his entire world collapsed into ash. Beverly, however, had the survival instincts of a cornered rat. As the audio recording played her gleeful confession to federal mortgage fraud, she realized her high society charade was permanently over. She dropped her small designer clutch and began backing away from the dessert station. She tried to blend into the shadows near the heavy velvet curtains at the rear of the ballroom. She was desperately scanning the perimeter for an exit, hoping to slip out the service doors and vanish into the night before the hammer fell. She thought she could simply walk away from the destruction she had caused, just like she had done her entire life. She thought wrong. The massive mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a heavy, resonant thud. The entire crowd turned to look as the final act of my live demonstration walked into the room. Two uniformed police detectives strode into the grand space, their polished silver badges catching the light of the chandeliers. Walking right between them was a stern federal agent from the Financial Crimes Division, wearing a dark suit and a perfectly neutral expression. They moved with absolute terrifying purpose, parting the sea of wealthy guests effortlessly. Trailing closely behind the federal agent was another police officer dragging a very familiar figure by the arm. It was Jason. He had been waiting outside by the valet stand, pacing nervously, while waiting for Beverly and Preston to come out with news of my surrender. Instead, he had been intercepted and detained by local law enforcement the moment he stepped onto the hotel property. His expensive designer jacket was violently rumpled, and his face was pale with sheer absolute terror. He looked like a frightened little boy realizing there was no one left to bail him out. The officers marched straight down the center aisle. They walked right past Preston, who was hyperventilating and clutching his chest as if he were having a heart attack. The federal agent did not even look at my husband. Preston was a disgraced, ruined man, but his specific crimes required a corporate tribunal and a separate federal indictment that would come later. Tonight the authorities were here for the immediate threat. They headed straight for the velvet curtains where my mother was trying to hide behind a large floral arrangement. Beverly Anderson, the federal agent, announced, his deep voice carrying easily over the dead silent crowd. "You and Jason Anderson are under arrest for felony forgery, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit federal extortion." Beverly let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. She tried to pull away, slapping her hands against the heavy curtains in a blind panic. "I am her mother," she screamed, looking wildly around the room for anyone who would defend her. "This is a family matter. You cannot arrest me. I am a respectable woman." The female detective grabbed her wrists and spun her around, completely ignoring her frantic, pathetic protests. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly across the breathless ballroom. The sound was crisp and final, signaling the absolute end of her reign of manipulation. Jason began sobbing openly as the other officer cuffed his hands behind his back. He begged for someone to call a lawyer, claiming he was just a consultant and that his mother had made him do it. Even in his final moments of freedom, he was still trying to push the blame onto the woman who had sacrificed my future to coddle him. They were turning on each other just as I knew they would. I stood at the clear acrylic podium bathed in the bright stage lights, and watched the police march my mother and brother out of the grand ballroom in chains. The audience watched in stunned, horrified silence as the architects of my lifelong misery were dragged out the heavy wooden doors and out of my life forever. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind them, severing my mother and brother from high society permanently. The silence inside the grand ballroom was absolute. Every billionaire, venture capitalist, and journalist in the room turned their collective gaze back to the center aisle. Preston was still standing there, but he was no longer a tech visionary. He was a radioactive pariah. He looked around the room, his eyes pleading for a single sympathetic face. He found none. The prominent investors who had been shaking his hand just an hour ago physically turned their backs on him. They formed a wall of bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns, shutting him out completely. Brittany had been hovering near the dessert station, watching the entire catastrophic collapse unfold. When she saw the police drag Jason away and realized that Preston was completely broke and facing federal investigations, her survival instincts kicked in one last time. She did not walk over to comfort the man she was supposedly building a family with. She simply set her champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray, turned on her heel, and slipped out the side service exit. She abandoned the family, entirely vanishing into the night to find her next wealthy target. Preston was left standing completely alone in a room full of people. His reputation was globally obliterated. He was bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and permanently exiled from the technology industry. He slowly turned and walked out of the ballroom looking like a hollow ghost. I finished my keynote speech to a standing ovation. The next morning, the Seattle sky was bright and clear. I drove up to the sprawling luxury estate that I had purchased out of foreclosure all those years ago. I did not come alone. I brought my private security team and a professional moving crew. We walked into the quiet, empty house and went straight to the guest wings where Beverly and Jason had been living their fraudulent billionaire lifestyles. I stood in the hallway and watched the movers pack up their belongings. They took the designer clothes Beverly had bought with my stolen corporate funds. They took the expensive watches and shoes Jason had acquired while pretending to be a successful entrepreneur. The movers tossed everything into cheap standard cardboard boxes. They did not use bubble wrap or care for the delicate fabrics. They taped the boxes shut with loud, sharp tearing sounds that echoed off the high ceilings. We carried the boxes outside and stacked them directly on the curb next to the street. I looked at the pile of cardboard sitting on the concrete. It was the perfect physical representation of their entire existence. Cheap, fragile, and ultimately destined for the trash. I sent a single text message to the public defender, who had been assigned to represent them in federal court, letting him know where his clients could send someone to collect their garbage. I walked back inside the house and locked the front door. The space felt massive and empty, but it also felt remarkably clean. The suffocating toxicity that had permeated the walls for years was finally gone. I pulled out my phone and called my real estate agent. I told her to list the property immediately. I did not want to spend another night in a house that held so many terrible memories. The Seattle real estate market was fiercely competitive, and the estate sold in less than a week for a massive multi-million-dollar profit. When the funds cleared my bank account, I sat in my temporary hotel suite, looking at the astronomical number on the screen. I did not need the money. My position at Apex Capital provided me with more wealth than I could ever spend in a lifetime. I realized I had a unique opportunity to transform the pain of my past into a powerful weapon for the future. I called Harrison and my financial team to set up a new venture. I did not want to create a standard charitable foundation. I wanted to build something aggressive and highly targeted. We established the Apex Genesis Fund. It was a powerful multi-million-dollar scholarship and seed funding program designed strictly for underestimated self-starting women. The criteria for the fund were highly specific. We targeted women who had been marginalized, financially abused, or completely discarded by their toxic families. I wanted to find the 18-year-old girls whose college funds had been stolen by greedy parents. I wanted to find the brilliant female entrepreneurs who were constantly overlooked in favor of mediocre golden child brothers. I took the massive profit from the sale of the house where my family had abused me, and I used it to directly empower women who were exactly like me. Within the first month of launching the Apex Genesis Fund, we fully funded the university tuitions of 50 young women and provided initial startup capital to a dozen female-led technology companies. We were building an army of independent, powerful women who would never have to rely on toxic family members for survival. As my new foundation flourished, the architects of my misery faced their inevitable ruin. Beverly and Jason were denied bail due to the sheer magnitude of their financial fraud and the overwhelming flight risk they posed. They sat in a federal holding facility, waiting for a trial they were guaranteed to lose. The prosecuting attorneys told Harrison that my mother and brother were currently facing up to 15 years in federal prison. Preston faced a different kind of prison. He was not immediately arrested, but the Securities and Exchange Commission launched a massive federal investigation into his business practices following my public presentation at the gala. The legal fees drained whatever personal savings he had managed to hide. Without his stolen code, without my silent funding, and without a single investor willing to take his phone calls, he was completely destitute. The last update I received from a former colleague placed Preston working a graveyard shift at a minimum wage data entry center in a run-down industrial park outside the city. He spent his nights typing numbers into a glowing screen, entirely exiled from the glittering tech world he had once claimed to rule. 6 months passed. The transition from the darkest period of my life to the brightest was remarkably seamless. I purchased a stunning new dual-level penthouse located in the very center of downtown Seattle. It featured massive wraparound windows, custom modern art, and a sprawling outdoor terrace that overlooked the glittering city skyline and the dark waters of the Puget Sound. It was a home built entirely on my own terms, completely free of compromise and hidden agendas. On a warm Friday evening, I hosted a private celebration at the penthouse to mark the 6-month anniversary of the Apex Genesis Fund. The living room was filled with the sounds of genuine laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. The guests in my home were not social climbers or parasitic relatives looking for a handout. They were brilliant venture capitalists, dedicated cybersecurity experts, and the incredible women whose businesses we had funded. Harrison was standing near the kitchen island telling a story that had half the room laughing. My lead forensic accountant was discussing a new software launch with a young female CEO I had personally mentored. I stood near the edge of the room watching the beautiful, vibrant community I had built. There was no tension in my shoulders. There was no anxiety humming in my chest waiting for someone to insult me or demand my money. I felt completely, deeply safe. I picked up a glass of rich red wine from a passing server and stepped through the sliding glass doors onto the outdoor terrace. The cool evening breeze swept off the water, carrying the fresh, clean scent of the ocean. The city lights sparkled below me like thousands of tiny diamonds scattered across black velvet. I walked to the edge of the glass railing and took a slow, satisfying sip of my wine. A soft buzz vibrated against my hip. I pulled my personal cell phone from the hidden pocket of my elegant black evening gown. The screen lit up in the dim light of the terrace. I looked down at the notification banner. It was a text message routed through an automated system indicating it originated from a monitored federal correctional facility. I opened the message. It was a long, rambling wall of text from Beverly. It was typed with the frantic, desperate energy of a woman who had finally realized she was entirely out of options. "Sienna, please, you have to help us." The message began heavily relying on the same emotional manipulation she had used her entire life. "Jason is not doing well in here. My health is failing. You proved your point, but you have to drop the charges and send the bail money. You are rich now. You can afford the lawyers to make this go away. Do not leave your mother in this terrible place. I forgive you for the gala. We can start over. Please, Sienna, we are still family." I read the words glowing on the screen. A year ago, a message like that would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and anxiety. A year ago, I would have questioned my own sanity and wondered if I was truly a terrible daughter for defending myself. I would have agonized over the concept of family loyalty and blood obligation. Tonight, I felt absolutely nothing. The words were just empty digital noise sent by a stranger I used to know. I did not read past the first line. I did not type out an angry response detailing exactly why she deserved to sit in a federal cell for the rest of her life. I did not demand an apology for the stolen college fund or the forged loan documents. She was completely irrelevant to my existence. I tapped the small information icon in the top corner of the screen. I selected the option to permanently block the number. Then I hit the delete button, erasing the message and wiping her final desperate plea from my phone and my life forever. I held down the power button on the side of the device. The screen faded to black, shutting off completely. I slipped the dead phone back into the pocket of my gown. I turned my back on the glittering city skyline and walked back inside my beautiful penthouse, stepping fully into a brilliant, unburdened future.